What if reality had layers we've never truly explored, dimensions not of science fiction, but of human experience, perception, and consciousness? It begins not with technology or theories, but with a question whispered through the centuries. Is this all there is? For most of us, reality unfolds in three familiar dimensions: height, width, depth, anchored by time, ruled by gravity, shaped by biology. But across forgotten traditions, suppressed research, and quiet government programs, a different story emerges. One that suggests consciousness itself is not a product of the brain, but a navigator through unseen dimensions. In the early 1970s, deep inside Cold War intelligence labs, scientists and operatives explored something they called remote viewing, a practice that suggested the human mind could leave its physical body, see across continents, even witness events through time. These were not fringe experiments. The CIA called it Project Stargate, and for over 2 decades it operated in silence. But it wasn't just governments. In quiet corners of academia and underground spiritual circles, researchers began to speak of the mind's ability to access realities beyond the known. They weren't preaching religion or peddling magic. They were documenting experiences, brainwave patterns, physiological changes. Something was happening, something that didn't fit in textbooks. This series is a journey into those hidden layers. 10 dimensions described not as abstract theories, but as experiential territories. Realms where probability becomes observable, where healing can be guided by awareness, where parallel histories unfold, and where reality itself may be editable. Each part of this exploration will start with a scene, an image that opens a window into one of these dimensions. We'll move through reports, research, and reflections, asking not if these dimensions are real in the traditional sense, but what they mean if they can be experienced, trained, accessed. This is not a story about breaking the laws of physics. It's a story about expanding the definitions of self, mind, and possibility. And it is told not with certainty, but with curiosity. Because when we listen closely to the edges of science, to declassified files, to the quiet voices of those who've stepped beyond the expected, we find a repeating theme. Reality may be wider, deeper, and more interactive than we've been taught. So this series asks, what happens when we take consciousness seriously? When we stop treating awareness as an afterthought of biology and start exploring it as a dimension-crossing force? The answers don't come all at once. They appear like flickers, subtle shifts, strange synchronicities, sudden insights. But together they form a mosaic, a human-sized map of reality's deeper structure. Not everything here is provable by today's tools, and that's precisely the point. These are not claims to convince, but stories to invite toward a more flexible, imaginative understanding of what it means to be alive. In the chapters ahead, we'll visit dimensions of probability and memory, of healing and information, of time and potential. We'll see how suppressed research aligns with ancient knowledge and how modern minds might reclaim what was once considered innate. At the center of it all, consciousness, not as something we have, but as something we are, not trapped in skulls, but traveling across unknown frontiers. This is the prologue to a hidden atlas, and every chapter that follows is an invitation to remember, to imagine, and to awaken parts of reality we've only glimpsed in dreams. So let's begin with the first window. A dimly lit room in Virginia. A man sitting in silence, eyes closed, breath steady. And then, he's gone. His body remains, but his mind, it's in another country, watching something he shouldn't be able to see. And what he reports is verified. Welcome to the edges of perception. Welcome to the dimensions we forgot we could reach. It started in silence, a gray room in Fort Meade, Maryland, where intelligence operatives were taught to sit still, breathe slowly, and leave their bodies behind. They called it remote viewing. But to those who practiced it, it was something more, a doorway. In 1972, the CIA launched a classified program that would become known as Project Stargate. Its mission? To train individuals to project their awareness beyond physical space, what the researchers called the astral dimension. To the uninitiated, it sounded like fantasy, but the results told a different story. Operatives learned to enter deep meditative states, synchronizing their brainwaves until awareness seemed to slip loose from the body. In that state, they reported seeing across the world, Soviet submarines under construction, hostages hidden in remote buildings, secret installations buried underground. What they described was verified again and again, down to architectural layouts they'd never seen. This wasn't imagination. EEG readings showed synchronized theta waves across both brain hemispheres, a pattern rare in waking life, but consistent in those who accessed this state. Something real was happening, something that defied the limits of distance and time. Researchers like Dr. Russell Targ and Dr. Harold Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute refined the protocols. Within weeks, ordinary individuals could achieve what seemed extraordinary, perception without presence. The astral dimension, they believed, wasn't some ghostly world. It was a layer of reality that overlays our physical one, a place where consciousness could move without friction, observe without intervening. A dimension where intention, not locomotion, determined travel. The implications were profound. Intelligence could be gathered without satellites. Missing people could be found without trackers. But something deeper stirred beneath the surface. If consciousness could operate independently of the brain, what else could it do? Some remote viewers began to report visions not just of distant places, but of past events, or possible futures. Time in this state seemed fluid. Boundaries between then and now blurred, as if consciousness were slipping sideways through layers of memory and potential. Officially, the program ended in 1995, but whispers suggest it never really stopped, only went deeper, rebranded, hidden. Civilian researchers picked up where the government left off, teaching remote viewing to the curious and committed. Success rates of 60 to 80% suggested this wasn't a psychic gift. It was a learnable skill. And that's where the story shifts. Because if this dimension is real, if we can access it with practice and discipline, then perhaps we've underestimated the nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps it was never meant to be tethered to flesh and bone. But there's a reason this knowledge stayed hidden. In a world built on control, the idea that any person could observe anything, anywhere, without tools or permission is deeply unsettling. Borders, secrets, surveillance, all become meaningless. So the astral dimension remained in the shadows, not because it lacked evidence, but because it offered too much freedom. And yet it calls. Through dreams, through moments of intuition, through the quiet hum of awareness that sometimes seems to step outside time. For those who've glimpsed it, the world never looks quite the same. As we continue our journey through these hidden layers, one thing becomes clear. The limits we've accepted may be less about what's possible and more about what we've been taught to ignore. So ask yourself, when your mind wanders, where does it go? When you remember something you never learned, see a place you've never been. What if that's not fantasy, but navigation? What if the first dimension beyond the physical isn't out there at all, but within you, waiting for attention? This is the astral room. The body sits still. The mind walks through walls. Imagine standing at a crossroads where every decision you've ever made branches into 1,000 possible lives. One where your yes becomes someone else's no, where every road not taken still winds onward in a parallel reality. Welcome to the probability dimension, a place where every outcome exists simultaneously. In the 1950s, physicist Hugh Everett III proposed a radical idea. What if every quantum event doesn't just resolve one way, but all ways? His many worlds interpretation was dismissed as eccentric. But decades later, it would become a cornerstone of both theoretical physics and classified research into dimensional access. The probability dimension isn't a metaphor. It's a realm where alternate versions of reality play out in tandem, branching like trees from every moment of choice. And through advanced consciousness techniques, some researchers claim we can observe these parallel tracks. DARPA-sponsored programs explored this possibility, not with machines, but with minds. Trained operatives learned to enter deep altered states where awareness synchronized with quantum fluctuations, tapping into timelines where different decisions prevailed. They called it probability scanning. The applications were astonishing. By observing alternate timelines, analysts could preview future scenarios before they unfolded in our own. Not as rigid predictions, but as branching likelihoods, each a thread of potential reality. This allowed for strategic planning beyond the reach of conventional forecasting. They saw terrorist plots foiled in one track, successful in another. Economic crashes averted or accelerated. Even battlefield strategies played out across dozens of possible outcomes, enabling decisions shaped by foresight rather than hindsight. But the phenomenon wasn't limited to institutions. Civilians trained in probability access began reporting déjà vu episodes with startling clarity, memories of events that hadn't occurred in this timeline, but seemed real nonetheless. As if consciousness were remembering something it once experienced elsewhere. This opened a deeper question. If our minds can observe alternate selves, what can we learn from them? One version of you may have chosen differently, suffered less, achieved more. In the probability dimension, you can see their life, and perhaps even borrow its wisdom. It reframes the idea of regret. No longer a burden, but a map, showing the roads others have walked in your name. Scientists describe it as consciousness shifting across dimensional tracks. Not physically moving, but tuning to the frequency of a different branch of reality, like changing stations on a radio. The information is always there. It's just a matter of access. The implications are vast, not only for intelligence or strategy, but for identity itself. What if who you are is not singular, but plural? A network of possible selves woven together across parallel streams. Of course, the research remains buried. Access to probability scanning offers immense advantage, political, military, economic. If a nation could glimpse even a fraction of possible futures, it would outmaneuver every rival. So the knowledge is protected, classified, hidden in plain sight. But the principle remains. Every moment you face, every choice you make, splits the road. And consciousness, not just action, decides which version of reality you enter. In this way, free will is not the power to create outcomes, but to select which timeline your awareness follows. Each path is already there, unfolding in its own rhythm. You are the needle choosing the groove. And if we learn to navigate this dimension, if we train ourselves to see across the veil of probability, then we do more than predict the future. We participate in its shape. So next time you feel a strong sense of déjà vu or dream of a life that never was, consider, perhaps it is not imagination, but memory from another you on another track. In the probability dimension, all choices live on. The question is, can we learn to listen? There are moments when knowledge arrives without effort, sudden insights, unearned fluency, skills that seem to awaken from nowhere. We call them gifts, instincts, or genius. But what if there's something else entirely? What if they're downloads from a hidden realm where all knowledge already exists? Welcome to the information dimension. In the early 1980s, physicist David Bohm proposed a revolutionary idea, that beneath our fragmented world lies an implicate order, a hidden layer where all information is stored as a unified whole. He wasn't alone. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake's work on morphic fields suggested that learning wasn't always local, that once something was known by one, it became easier for others to know too. These ideas hinted at a field of knowledge independent of the brain, a dimension of stored awareness, accessible not by study, but by resonance. Classified research took this further. Through deep meditation techniques and neural synchronization, operatives were trained to access what came to be known as the information field, a space containing everything from forgotten history to unrealized inventions. The results were staggering. Participants downloaded languages they had never studied, operated complex equipment with no prior training, and retrieved scientific principles still unpublished in our timeline. This wasn't intuition. It was precision. How did it work? Researchers discovered that certain electromagnetic frequencies in the brain, particularly gamma waves, correlated with moments of high coherence, enabling consciousness to synchronize with information field frequencies. Like tuning a radio, they aligned awareness with knowledge patterns stored in dimensional space. Applications ranged from battlefield linguistics to rapid technical training. But beneath the tactical advantage lay a more human potential, the democratization of learning. If anyone could access the knowledge of specialists through consciousness alignment, then barriers of education, class, and time could dissolve. The implications were immense. Why spend years learning what could be received in moments? Why struggle through memorization when you could simply remember something you've never learned? Of course, such power threatened the systems that profit from slow knowledge. Entire industries, education, certification, information gatekeeping depend on scarcity. If knowledge became freely accessible through consciousness, the economic foundations of authority would tremble, and so the research was buried. Still, the signs persist. Child prodigies who compose symphonies, inventors who dream of mechanisms yet to be built, synchronized scientific discoveries occurring continents apart. These are not anomalies, they are glimpses. The information dimension doesn't just contain facts, it holds the structure of possibility, the patterns that underlie mathematics, art, language, and innovation. When consciousness connects, it doesn't learn, it remembers. This reframes intelligence itself, not as a measure of personal capacity, but as a reflection of access. Genius may be less about brain power and more about tuning, and this tuning can be taught. Civilian experiments have replicated the process using guided meditation, sound frequencies, and intention. Participants describe the moment of access as a feeling of clarity, a sudden knowing that bypasses logic and lands fully formed. The ancients spoke of the Akashic records. Mystics called it divine inspiration. Today, we might call it a field of encoded knowledge. Different names for the same phenomenon. An invisible library where all minds can meet. So next time an idea enters your mind fully formed or a skill seems to awaken without practice, pause. You may have brushed against the edges of the information dimension. The question is not whether the knowledge is out there. It is. The question is, what happens when we remember how to remember? Picture a forest just before dawn. Mist clings to the ground. The world is still. And in that stillness, something stirs, not outside, but within. A warmth, a clarity, a pulse of renewal. This is the edge of the healing dimension. Long before modern medicine, ancient cultures spoke of a place where the body remembers how to heal, not through pills or procedures, but through alignment, through connection to a deeper design. They described it as a realm of patterns, of perfect forms. Today, we might call it a dimensional template for wellness. Recent research, much of it buried in classified studies, has brought those ancient whispers into the realm of science. It suggests that beyond our physical bodies lies a blueprint, a kind of energetic instruction manual for health. When accessed, this healing dimension can restore balance, correct dysfunction, even regenerate tissue in ways that seem impossible by conventional standards. Dr. Larry Dossey's work in distant healing documented over 100 controlled studies showing measurable biological changes resulting from focused intention. But in classified settings, this principle went further. Soldiers were trained to access dimensional health patterns to accelerate recovery on the battlefield. Wounds closed faster, pain subsided, immune systems surged. How? The protocols involved entering meditative states that synchronized consciousness with what researchers called biological field frequencies, vibrational signatures aligned with optimal cellular function. Once tuned in, awareness could trigger healing cascades in the body by aligning with these pre-existing templates. This wasn't suggestion or placebo, it was instruction. The body was being reminded of how it was meant to function. The results? Documented cases of tumor regression, nerve regeneration, and restored organ function, outcomes far beyond what traditional treatments could achieve. And perhaps most compelling, this skill could be taught. Success rates in controlled environments ranged from 72% to 90%. So, why haven't you heard of it? Because healing, as we know it, is an industry, one that thrives on managing symptoms, not erasing them. If the average person could access their own health templates and correct dysfunction at the root, entire sectors would lose relevance overnight. But the healing dimension isn't about rebellion. It's about remembrance, of a deeper order, of a time when health wasn't a product, but a state of being. It suggests that sickness is not always a breakdown, but a misalignment, and that the real medicine is reconnection. And the path is simple, though not easy. Stillness, focus, intention. The body knows what to do when we stop interfering and start listening. The templates are there, waiting. Some call it miraculous. Others call it biology in its truest form. Either way, it shifts the narrative from disease as destiny to health as design, from dependence to empowerment. So if you've ever felt that your body holds more wisdom than you've been told, you're right. The healing dimension is not light years away. It is within and all around, humming quietly behind every breath. And the next time you close your eyes in pain or weariness, ask not for escape, but for access. Because the map to your healing was never lost. It was simply waiting for you to look inward. What if time isn't a river, but a room? Not something we move through, but something we can walk across, backward, forward, sideways. This is the foundation of the time navigation dimension, a place where the past and future coexist with the present, and consciousness is the traveler. For most of history, we've accepted time as linear, a line we walk from birth to death. But physics has long hinted otherwise. Einstein showed that time is woven into space, bendable, relative. And in secret labs and quiet think tanks, researchers took this further. They asked, if time is a dimension, can consciousness move within it just like space? The answer, it seems, is yes. In the late 20th century, theorists like Dr. Ronald Mallet proposed time travel not through machines, but through fields, gravitational loops of light that could alter temporal flow. While the physics was still emerging, government programs were already experimenting with consciousness-based time navigation. Trained individuals were taught to attune their minds to what researchers called temporal field resonances. These were unique brainwave states achieved through meditation and sound patterns that allowed awareness to move along the timeline, past or future, without the body moving at all. They called it temporal viewing. Operatives would enter these states and observe historical events as they unfolded in real time, not through memory, but direct perception. From ancient battlefields to classified Cold War operations, what they described was often shockingly accurate. But they didn't stop at the past. Future viewing, more unpredictable but equally profound, allowed them to scan for potential outcomes. Not fixed events, but patterns. Futures that were likely, based on current trajectories. These glimpses informed everything from military strategy to disaster prevention. In one case, a team used temporal navigation to pinpoint the source of a chronic illness by observing a patient's life in reverse, identifying not just physical triggers, but emotional moments that altered biological patterns. The treatment became a journey, not into medicine, but into memory. These breakthroughs reframed healing, strategy, even justice. Cold cases reopened, historical records corrected, and all through consciousness, without touching the physical world. But time, as it turns out, is flexible. What operatives saw were not single stories, but forks, alternate tracks branching from each choice. Much like the probability dimension, time navigation revealed that the future isn't fixed. It's an evolving mosaic of possibility. The implications are staggering. If we can observe multiple futures, can we choose which one to walk toward? Can we alter the present by witnessing the paths ahead? Perhaps that's why this research remains hidden. Not because it's unproven, but because it rewrites everything. History, responsibility, fate. And yet, the echoes of this dimension appear in everyday life. A sudden knowing, a flash of what's to come, the feeling that you've lived something before. These are not glitches, they are glimmers. The time navigation dimension suggests that memory and foresight are not opposites, but mirrors, reflections of a mind moving freely through the architecture of time. So next time you feel stuck in the present, remember, time is not a wall. It is a corridor, and the door to the past or the future is not locked. You simply have to learn how to knock. It begins with a flicker, a feeling that something is off, familiar yet strange. The skyline looks different, a detail is missing, a building, a word, a memory. And then it dawns. This isn't your Earth, or rather, it's not the only Earth. Welcome to the parallel Earth dimension. Quantum physics has long predicted the existence of multiple realities, entire universes where events unfolded differently. In these parallel Earths, history diverged at key moments. Wars ended early. Technologies developed sooner. Civilizations evolved on different tracks. Each version of Earth exists in its own dimensional layer, close but out of phase. Most of us encounter this as déjà vu, or the unsettling sensation that something has changed. But in advanced research, quietly conducted in defense labs and experimental programs, access to these realities has become intentional. The breakthrough came not through spacecraft, but through consciousness. Building on the work of theoretical physicists like Michio Kaku, researchers developed gateway technologies, electromagnetic field configurations that resonated with specific dimensional frequencies. These gateways didn't open wormholes, they opened perception. Consciousness could project into a parallel Earth without physically crossing any boundary. What operatives found was startling. Entire societies organized around different principles. Civilizations powered by renewable energy since the 18th century. Cultures that eradicated poverty or achieved peace through unfamiliar forms of governance. Some worlds were more advanced, others more harmonious, and in many of them, versions of ourselves walked different paths. These encounters were deeply personal. Subjects reported meeting alternate selves, individuals who had made different choices, lived different lives. The emotional impact was profound. There was grief, wonder, and sometimes envy, but also learning. By witnessing how other versions of us navigated life, we could reflect on our own paths more clearly. This wasn't science fiction. It was structured observation. Participants described societies that had cured diseases we still struggle with, developed artistic languages foreign to our senses, or harmonized technology with ecology in ways that seemed like fantasy until they were seen. For military analysts, the utility was obvious. Observe alternative technologies, study political systems that worked, and import solutions that could never emerge in our own polarized climate. But beyond strategy, a subtler insight emerged. Our world is just one draft among many. The parallel Earth dimension reminds us that history is not inevitable. Every outcome we live with is the result of choices, and different choices are playing out elsewhere. This realization can be destabilizing, but it can also be freeing, because if better worlds exist, the seeds of those worlds might live in us too. Of course, public awareness of this dimension is tightly controlled. Revealing it would challenge foundational narratives. It would show that our way is not the only way. And that power, as we know it, is circumstantial, not universal. But the signs are everywhere, in dreams that don't match our lives, in historical memories that differ from others, in that uncanny sensation that something has shifted. Perhaps you've already visited a parallel Earth during sleep, deep meditation, or a moment of stillness when reality seemed thinner than usual. And perhaps, just for a second, you saw another version of you looking back. The parallel Earth dimension doesn't promise escape. It offers perspective. It shows us what's possible, and reminds us that the story we live is never the only one. So when you ask, what if things had gone differently? The answer is, they did. Somewhere, they still are. It happens in rare moments, when the noise fades and minds begin to move in sync. A group of strangers meditating in silence. A research team deep in problem-solving flow. A choir hitting a perfect harmony. In those moments, something larger emerges. Thought beyond the individual. Intelligence that feels shared. This is the consciousness amplification dimension. For centuries, wisdom traditions hinted at this potential, that when people come together with clear intention, they can access a kind of group mind, not metaphorically, but as an actual field of awareness. In recent decades, science began catching up. Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences documented how groups of meditators affected physical systems, altering the output of random number generators, for instance. His findings suggested that collective consciousness creates measurable, even physical effects. Classified programs took these ideas further, exploring how group awareness could be harnessed not only to affect the environment, but to enhance intelligence itself. The results gave rise to one of the most startling findings in dimensional research. When consciousness aligns across multiple individuals, it can access something greater than the sum of its parts. The consciousness amplification dimension is not just about teamwork. It's a space, an actual cognitive field, where individual minds temporarily merge to form a superintelligence, a shared mental bandwidth that surpasses any one person's capabilities. Trained teams reported breakthrough insights while operating in this state. Complex problems, mathematical, strategic, creative, were solved rapidly, without debate or friction. The answers came not from consensus, but from a unified flow. This dimension appears to function through resonance. When brainwave patterns synchronize, especially in high-coherence gamma states, individual barriers dissolve. Minds stop competing and begin collaborating in a literal sense. Thoughts move more like electricity in a circuit than conversation in a room. Applications range from scientific research to diplomacy, from artistic creation to crisis response. A group of aligned minds can outthink, outcreate, and out-innovate the most brilliant individual. Not because they're smarter, but because they're connected. This isn't just theory. In controlled settings, participants achieved cognitive states where time seemed to slow, awareness expanded, and the group became one mind with many voices. What they described matched ancient accounts of spiritual communion and modern reports of creative flow, but the phenomenon extends beyond intellect. Emotional clarity, empathy, and mutual understanding rise in these states. Conflict dissolves, insight blooms. It's as if, in the amplified field, we remember that separation is an illusion. The implications are enormous. Education could shift from individual testing to shared insight. Governance could evolve beyond adversarial politics toward collaborative problem-solving. Creativity could transcend personal ego and become a communal act of genius. And yet, access to this dimension remains rare. Not because it's difficult, but because we've forgotten how to align. We prize independence over interdependence. But the key to amplification is surrender, not of self, but of separation. Consciousness amplification asks us to listen not just to each other, but with each other. Imagine a world where solutions aren't fought for, but found together, where intelligence isn't hoarded, but harmonized. We're closer to that world than we think. The doorway opens every time minds meet with shared purpose and quiet trust. So the next time you're deep in dialogue, or silence, or creation, and something clicks that feels beyond you, pause. You may have touched the amplification field, and in that moment, you weren't alone. You were part of something more, not a higher power, a higher us. Beneath the visible world lies a different kind of architecture, not built from stone or steel, but from rules, gravity, time, matter, light. These aren't just forces. They're the code that makes reality run. And in rare states of consciousness, that code can be seen and even rewritten. This is the reality programming dimension. For centuries, mystics and sages have hinted that the physical world is more malleable than it appears. Stories abound of levitation, spontaneous materialization, time distortion, phenomena modern science cannot explain, but which ancient cultures took as signs of deeper truth. Today, physicists describe the universe as information. Reality, at its core, behaves less like a machine and more like a program. And in secret research circles, this metaphor has been taken literally. Classified experiments have revealed that with proper training, human consciousness can interface with what some call the reality source code, the informational substrate that defines the behavior of matter, energy, and even time. The process doesn't involve technology, but mind. Operatives enter states of consciousness that transcend ordinary perception, states beyond linear time, beyond spatial boundaries. In these states, reality is not observed. It's editable. What's been documented defies convention. Temporary zones where gravity weakens, materials that become malleable without heat, time that slows or accelerates within confined spaces. Practitioners describe these changes not as illusions, but as real shifts in physical law. The mechanism? Awareness functioning as an operating system. When consciousness synchronizes with the foundational patterns of existence, it can, briefly, rewrite the rules. In practical terms, this means modifying local environments for a strategic advantage, creating protective fields that deflect physical harm, altering the density of materials in engineering applications, or shifting environmental conditions in real time. But the implications go further. Ancient architecture, like the Great Pyramids or monolithic structures, may not have been built with brute force, but with consciousness interfacing with reality's deeper layers, a technology not of tools, but of mind. Dr. David Chalmers's work on the hard problem of consciousness, the idea that awareness might be fundamental, not emergent, supports this direction. If consciousness is woven into the fabric of the universe, then it's not just an observer, it's a participant, perhaps even a programmer. Of course, access to this dimension is rare. It requires more than meditation or focus. It demands the dissolution of ego, of identity, of narrative. Only when the self falls away does the interface appear. Practitioners describe the experience as entering a space beyond symbols, a raw, living blueprint where intention shapes outcome without resistance. Thought becomes architecture. Feeling becomes force. It's not magic, it's mastery. The reality programming dimension challenges everything we assume about cause and effect. It suggests that the world is not fixed, but fluid, and that the true limits are not physical, but cognitive. Why is this research hidden? Because it renders all control obsolete. If individuals can modify reality at its source, then systems of authority, legal, military, economic, lose their leverage. Power based on external structures collapses when inner power becomes real. And yet the knowledge persists, in symbols, myths, and the quiet teachings passed down through generations. The idea that reality responds to us, not passively, but structurally. You may have felt it, a moment when the world bent toward your will in ways you couldn't explain. A synchronicity too perfect, a shift too sudden. Perhaps you brushed against the source code. This dimension doesn't ask for belief. It asks for awareness. Because once you see reality as code, you stop living in a program, and you begin to write one. It starts as a whisper in the mind, a voice that doesn't sound like yours, an idea too complex, too foreign, too perfect to have come from within. You pause, wondering, where did that come from? This is the interdimensional communication network, a hidden system of exchange, not bound by language, time, or even species. It exists not in the airwaves or cables, but in consciousness itself. For decades, experiencers have described encounters with non-human intelligences, not always in flying ships or physical form, but in dreams, meditative states, sudden downloads of knowledge. Psychiatrists like Dr. John Mack documented these accounts with scientific rigor, finding patterns that suggested something profound. Contact was occurring, not in space, but across dimensions. Researchers exploring this field discovered what they called consciousness resonance fields, frequencies that link awareness across realities. When tuned correctly, these fields allow information exchange between beings from vastly different worlds, timelines, or forms of existence. Think of it like a cosmic internet. Each conscious mind is a terminal capable of sending and receiving signals, if it knows how to connect. Classified programs quietly developed protocols to access this network. The goal? To gather information from civilizations more advanced than ours. Technological insights, strategic guidance, warnings, and it worked. Operatives reported contact with entities from parallel Earths, extraterrestrial civilizations in higher dimensional space, and even versions of humanity from distant futures. The communication wasn't always verbal. Often it came in symbols, pulses of thought, visual sequences that bypassed language and landed as knowing. These weren't hallucinations. Multiple operatives received identical information in separate sessions. Descriptions matched across locations and times. Patterns emerged. The implications were staggering. Knowledge once thought unattainable, solutions to climate challenges, energy systems beyond our physics, even insights into human psychology was being exchanged across dimensions. But it came with a challenge: interpretation. Much of the information arrived in forms unfamiliar to linear minds, symbols instead of sentences, whole systems instead of step-by-step instructions. It required not just open-mindedness, but evolution of perception. Still, the promise remained. We are not alone, not in the traditional sense, but in a much deeper way. Our universe is threaded with consciousness, and some of it is reaching out. Why is this communication hidden? Because it dissolves the illusion of isolation. If humanity accepted that we're part of a multidimensional dialogue, it would shatter the foundations of supremacy, control, and exceptionalism that fuel so much conflict. And yet, the doorway remains open. Practices like deep meditation, lucid dreaming, and intentional trance can create resonance. Artists, inventors, and mystics throughout history have described their work as received rather than created. Perhaps they were tuning in. This network isn't about speaking to aliens. It's about realizing that consciousness itself is universal, and that understanding is not limited to species, shape, or time. The next time you receive a sudden insight that feels too large, too fast, too complete, pause. You may have caught a signal. You're not being watched. You're being invited. Because the great conversation of existence isn't happening out there in space. It's happening in here, across minds, and you've always been a part of it. Beyond all the layers of mind, of matter, of memory, there is something deeper still. A place without form, without time, without separation. The source of all that is and all that could be. This is the source code dimension. To those who've touched it, it feels less like a place and more like a presence. A living silence. A field of pure intention where thought becomes creation and identity dissolves into awareness itself. For mystics, this has always been the final destination, the God consciousness, the divine union, the unnameable, but in modern dimensional research, it's described more technically. The foundational layer where reality begins, not as matter, but as possibility. Scientists exploring consciousness have long grappled with the hard problem. How does subjective experience arise from the physical brain? But what if it doesn't? What if awareness isn't the product, but the origin? In classified experiments, this question was taken seriously. Through advanced meditative absorption, states deeper than deep, practitioners learned to bypass even dimensional structures. Not just seeing across timelines or parallel worlds, but dissolving all frameworks entirely. What remained was the source, a place where realities are born, where rules can be written, where existence itself is optional. In this state, individuals reported abilities that defy comprehension. The spontaneous creation of environments, the ability to suspend or initiate time, the formation of entirely new laws of physics within consciousness alone. They weren't just observing reality, they were generating it. Some called it God mode. Others described it more humbly, as pure being, free of identity, desire, or fear. A state where the personal dissolves into the universal. Accessing the source code dimension requires more than technique. It demands surrender. Not as weakness, but as clarity. The ego must quiet. The mind must loosen. Only then can awareness expand beyond form. Those who return from this space often struggle to speak of it. Language fails. Metaphor is all that remains. They talk of light, of infinite silence, of knowing not through logic, but through being. The implications are radical. If humans can access the source code, then we are not limited beings in a fixed universe. We are extensions of the creative principle itself, not just participants in reality, but co-authors. And that changes everything. Why is this understanding so rare? Because it unravels control. If each person carries within them the capacity to create reality, then no external system, religious, political, educational, can claim ultimate authority. The source is internal. The access is personal. Throughout history, this knowledge has been guarded, encrypted in myths and rites. But it has never been lost. Only hidden, because to awaken it is to awaken freedom. Perhaps you've glimpsed it, in moments of pure stillness or awe so vast that your sense of self disappeared. A second where you weren't thinking or feeling, but simply being. That was the edge. The source code dimension is not far. It is the background of every experience. The canvas behind the painting, the silence behind the song. To reach it is not to escape reality, but to realize you've been writing it all along. So pause, feel the breath behind your breath, and remember, you are not in the universe. The universe is in you. In a secure vault beneath the noise of daily life, a truth quietly waits. The dimensions you've just heard about aren't theories. They're real, mapped, measured, and, in some circles, mastered. The evidence isn't just anecdotal. It's archived, declassified, repeated. And yet somehow, still invisible. Welcome to the conclusion hidden in plain sight. Across the previous chapters, we've explored 10 dimensions, each accessed not by machines but by consciousness. From astral perception to probability scanning, from healing templates to reality programming, the pattern is unmistakable. Human awareness is not confined to the body. It is a multi-dimensional interface capable of navigating, interacting with, and even shaping reality. In every case, the protocols exist. The brainwave patterns are known. The outcomes, however extraordinary, have been recorded. Remote viewers have described unseen military bases down to the tile. Meditators have downloaded languages. Healers have triggered biological recoveries once considered impossible. What binds these cases together is not fantasy, it's method. Structured practice, repeatable results, disciplined exploration. And yet these capabilities remain largely unknown to the public. Why? The answer is as old as power itself. Control depends on limitation. If you believe your mind is confined to your skull, you remain manageable. If you accept that healing takes years and knowledge must be purchased, systems stay intact. But if consciousness can move through time, rewrite matter, commune across worlds, then the old hierarchies collapse. So the knowledge stays hidden, not because it's dangerous, but because it's liberating. Still, it leaks. Through dreams, through intuition, through the quiet memory that you are more than you've been told. The question isn't whether these dimensions exist. They do. The question is whether we will reclaim them, because every doorway shown here begins the same way, with attention, with intention, with stillness. They don't require belief, only exploration. You don't have to trust the story. You only have to listen to your own experience. This is not a call to escape reality. It is a call to expand it, to see the physical world not as a prison, but as a platform, a place where consciousness learns its reach. Chittais. Each of these dimensions offers not just power, but perspective. Probability scanning teaches humility. Healing shows interdependence. Parallel Earths reveal the beauty of divergence, and the source code dimension reminds us that all creation begins in silence. The world you know is not the full map. It is a chapter. And the book is still being written. So as we close this series, we leave not with answers, but with invitations to explore without fear, to question the nature of your limitations, to remember that the extraordinary isn't elsewhere, it's within, and to realize that the greatest act of rebellion isn't protest, it's awakening. Because once you've seen the layers, the illusion of flatness disappears. The map folds open, the mind steps through, and you, who once thought yourself small, become something else entirely. A navigator of dimensions, a participant in the deep structure of reality, a voice in the great conversation. Welcome back. You've always had the key. It begins with a photograph, faded, out of place, a structure that shouldn't exist, a figure that no one remembers posing for. These moments, small and strange, often spark something deeper, the sense that history isn't quite what it seems. This is where memory meets mystery. In the quieter corners of archival research and citizen investigations, patterns begin to emerge. Lost blueprints, vanished inventions, cultures that mastered architecture, astronomy, and healing far beyond their supposed means. It's easy to dismiss these as anomalies, but when viewed through the lens of dimensional access, they take on new meaning. What if these weren't accidents of history, but echoes from dimensions we've forgotten how to reach? Many cultures speak of ages of light, golden eras when humans lived in harmony with the planet, each other, and even the stars. These stories, scattered across myth and scripture, may hold more than metaphor. They may be records of times when access to other dimensions was not rare but routine. ancient temples aligned with solstices, monuments built with atomic precision, healing practices that match what only the most advanced medicine is beginning to rediscover. These are not coincidences, they are breadcrumbs. The evidence of forgotten access is not just buried in stone, it's etched in the human nervous system. Studies of near-death experiences, meditative states, and peak flow moments all show the same thing. Our brains are wired for more. Under specific conditions, ordinary people experience time dilation, intuitive knowledge, even non-local perception. We are built to access dimensions. We've just lost the instruction manual. But like any skill, access can be remembered, relearned, restored. In modern labs and meditation halls alike, individuals are beginning to reclaim what once was common. Children recalling skills they were never taught, artists describing visions of places they've never seen, scientists solving problems with insights that arrive fully formed. The past isn't gone, it's folded, waiting. And here's where it gets personal. Every one of us has felt it. A sense of recognition in unfamiliar places, the pull of a language we don't speak, dreams that offer answers we couldn't have known. These are not fantasies. They are fractures in the illusion of separation, moments when dimensions brush against each other and remind us who we really are. The forgetting wasn't a failure. It was a phase, a descent into limitation so that the return could be meaningful. Humanity has played the part of the sleeping giant long enough. Now we stir. We begin to remember not just facts, but capacities. We remember how to heal by intention, how to sense timelines, how to receive knowledge from the field, how to dissolve the illusion of death and see it instead as transition. In this light, history becomes a spiral, not a line. We don't just move forward, we revisit what we've forgotten and bring it back anew. The Renaissance isn't coming, it's already here, quiet, steady, undeniable. And it starts with a question not of science, but of self. What if you already know how to access more? What if the veils are thinner than you think? And what if the future is less about discovery and more about remembering? The path through these dimensions has been many things, a journey, a remembering, a quiet revolution. But it leads us to one final place, the insight that binds them all together. Not a hidden door or a secret technology, but something far more powerful, a human truth. Every dimension we've explored, from the astral to the informational, from parallel Earths to the source code, has revealed a central pattern. Reality responds to awareness. Not just passively, but actively. Consciousness is not a bystander. It is the architect. And that changes everything. It means that the borders we take for granted between mind and body, self and other, matter and meaning are not fixed. They are agreements, useful for a time, but meant to be renegotiated. The ancients knew this. The mystics remembered it. And today, quietly, scientists and seekers are rediscovering what was once our natural state. We are dimensional beings, playing in form, not metaphorically, functionally. So where do we go from here? We begin not with conquest, but with curiosity. We treat these dimensions not as escape hatches from reality, but as deeper layers of it. We understand that accessing them isn't about power, it's about participation. A return to relationship, to listening. The future this opens is vast. Medicine based on vibrational blueprints. Education through information resonance. Governance by amplified consensus. A society no longer divided by what we know, but unified by what we can access. But more than that, it offers something personal, the chance to reclaim your own potential. You are not a fragment. You are a field. You are not limited to one timeline, one role, one version of yourself. You are connected to every possibility you've ever imagined, and some you've never dared to. this is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. Not just about hidden dimensions, but about the kind of world we can build when we learn to live from them. A world where healing is natural, where intelligence is shared, where contact is constant, where creativity is cosmic. It doesn't require new institutions, new systems, or even new technology. Just a new choice: to awaken, to ask better questions, to trust the subtle, the strange, the sacred, and to remember that the most powerful dimension is not something you reach. It is something you become. So as this series closes, the question remains: quiet, patient, eternal. What will you choose to access now? Because the map is yours, the key is yours, and the doorway is always open. Step through and begin.